The P-40 Warhawk, the plane history called a failure, destroyed 297 Japanese aircraft in 6 months. The Flying Tigers lost just 4 pilots in air combat. That's a 25-to-1 kill ratio, flying what textbooks call obsolete. But the failure wasn't the airplane. It was corrupt generals at Wright Field running side businesses while making procurement decisions, and corporate fraud so severe it triggered a congressional investigation. This is the story they buried for 80 years. The 325th Fighter Group in North Africa shot down 135 Axis aircraft, 96 of them Messerschmitt 109s, while losing just 17 P-40s. Over 200 pilots became aces in this supposedly inferior airplane across 7 nations. So why does history remember the P-40 Warhawk as a failure? Because the system was so broken that the truth got buried. If you search for information about the P-40 Warhawk, you'll find the same narrative repeated everywhere. It was available in large numbers when the war started. It did its job, but it was outclassed by newer designs, a necessary stopgap until better fighters arrived. Aviation historian Carl Molesworth, author of P-40 Warhawk versus Bf-109 and the foremost P-40 expert alive, calls this narrative the most persistent myth in American aviation history. The P-40 wasn't just available, it was the backbone of Allied air power during the war's most desperate years. It flew in China, Burma, India, North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Southwest Pacific, Alaska, and even defended Australia when Japanese bombers threatened Darwin. General Henry H. Hap Arnold, commanding general of the entire Army Air Forces, said it plainly. But for the P-40, the Japanese would have come all the way to Australia. That's not the assessment of an obsolete aircraft. That's the assessment of a plane that held the line when nothing else could. But somewhere between 1945 and 1960, the narrative shifted. The P-40 became a footnote. The P-51 Mustang became the legend. And nobody asked why a plane that produced 200 aces got written out of history, while newer designs that arrived years later got all the glory. The answer involves documented corruption at the highest levels of the Army Air Forces, corporate fraud so severe it triggered a congressional investigation, and a systematic failure that cost American pilots their lives. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what really happened in history, not just the sanitized version, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Now back to the P-40. Claire Lee Chennault was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Army Air Corps when he retired in 1937. He went to China as an advisor and spent 4 years studying Japanese tactics firsthand. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and developed tactics specifically designed to exploit what the P-40 did well. When the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, entered combat on December 20th, 1941, just 13 days after Pearl Harbor, they were flying P-40Bs, the earliest, least capable variant. No self-sealing fuel tanks, only 2 nose-mounted guns and 4 wing guns. It didn't matter. In their first engagement, Flying Tigers pilots intercepted Japanese bombers heading for Kunming. They shot down 4. The surviving Japanese dropped their bombs short and fled. Chennault had told his pilots that if they could destroy 1/4 of any attacking bomber formation, the Japanese would not come back. He was right. They didn't. Over the next 6.5 months, this small group of former Army, Navy, and Marine pilots flying planes the British had rejected for European combat achieved something unprecedented: 297 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. Between 4 and 9 pilots lost in air-to-air combat, depending on the source. 19 to 20 Flying Tigers became aces in less than 7 months. Historian Daniel Ford examined Japanese records and found overclaiming on both sides. Even his most conservative analysis concluded the Flying Tigers compiled a record without equal in the annals of aerial warfare. But the Flying Tigers were just the beginning. What happened next makes the inferior label even harder to explain. In North Africa, the P-40 replaced the Hawker Hurricane as the primary fighter of the Desert Air Force, not because there was nothing else available, but because it was better. The Royal Air Force 112 Squadron was the first Allied unit to paint shark mouths on their fighters. They did it while flying P-40 Tomahawks against German and Italian aircraft over Egypt and Libya. The American 57th Fighter Group arrived in the Middle East in 1942 and immediately began racking up victories. The 325th Fighter Group, known as the Checkertails, shot down 135 enemy aircraft while losing only 17 P-40s. That's an 8-to-1 kill ratio against some of the most experienced Luftwaffe pilots in the world. On April 18, 1943, the Palm Sunday Massacre became one of the most lopsided aerial victories of the entire war. 4 squadrons of P-40 Warhawks intercepted a massive formation of German Junkers Ju-52 transport planes returning from resupplying the Africa Corps in Tunisia. The transports were hugging the Mediterranean, trying to avoid detection. The P-40 fighters found them anyway. The result was absolute destruction. P-40 pilots claimed 100 transport aircraft shot down plus 16 of their escort fighters. Allied losses were 6 P-40 fighters and 1 Spitfire. The action effectively ended German aerial resupply to North Africa and hastened the surrender of the Africa Corps. 23 American pilots became aces in the Mediterranean theater flying P-40 Warhawks. Most of them served in the first half of 1943. Take a breath. We're not even halfway through the combat record. In the China-Burma-India theater, P-40 units accounted for 973 confirmed kills. That's nearly 65% of all enemy aircraft destroyed in the theater. The 14th Air Force under Chennault racked up over 2,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed against only 127 American planes lost in aerial combat. The Royal New Zealand Air Force claimed 100 aerial victories against 20 losses in P-40s, a 5-to-1 ratio. Australian ace Clive Caldwell scored 22 of his 28.5 victories flying P-40s, making him the highest-scoring Warhawk pilot of the war. In one legendary engagement over the Egyptian desert in August 1941, Caldwell's Tomahawk was hit by over 100 machine gun bullets and 520mm cannon shells. He was wounded 3 times. He still shot down his attacker and flew home. Canadian ace James Edwards shot down German ace Otto Schultz, who had 51 victories to his name while flying a P-40. An aircraft often labeled inferior had destroyed a Luftwaffe expert flying a supposedly superior Messerschmitt 109. This is not the combat record of an obsolete aircraft. This is the combat record of a fighter that could kill anything it faced when flown by pilots who understood its strengths. So why was it labeled inferior? The P-40's single genuine weakness was high-altitude performance above 15,000 feet. Its Allison Vive 1710 engine began losing power rapidly. By 20,000 feet, it was struggling. By 25,000 feet, it was outclassed by almost everything. This was real. This was documented. It became the only thing many people remembered. But here's what critics conveniently forgot. The P-40's engine limitation was not an inherent flaw of the airframe. It was a deliberate procurement decision made years before the war. The Allison Vive 1710 used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. That arrangement was adequate for low and medium-altitude operations, but it couldn't maintain power in thin air. The United States Army Air Forces had invested heavily in General Electric turbo superchargers, which worked brilliantly in twin-engine aircraft like the P-38 Lightning. Single-engine fighters, however, couldn't accommodate the bulky turbocharger system, so the P-40 and the P-39. Era Cobra were left with the basic mechanical blower while the generals waited for the turbo technology to mature. But look at the combat maps from World War II and you'll see something the critics missed. Most combat in the theaters where the P-40 actually fought happened well below 16,000 feet. In North Africa, the Desert War played out at medium altitude. In China, Burma, and India, the same. In the Southwest Pacific, the same. In the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, the same. At these altitudes, the P-40 wasn't just competitive, it was deadly. Aviation writer Patrick Mell documented that the P-40C's top speed of 345 miles per hour essentially matched the Spitfire IA at 346 miles per hour, the Bf-109E at 348 miles per hour, and exceeded the A-6M0 at 331 miles per hour, and the Hurricane II at 327 miles per hour. Japanese pilots rated the P-40 their most dangerous opponent at low altitude. The Warhawk could outdive virtually anything it faced. It could pull over 9 Gs in a dive compared to the Zero's 6 G structural limit. Its roll rate exceeded the Spitfire Mark V above 245 miles per hour according to official NACA testing. But the British Air Ministry tested the P-40 Tomahawk against Northwest European requirements, where combat occurred at 25,000 to 30,000 feet against high-altitude Luftwaffe interceptors. They declared it completely unsuitable. This verdict was accurate for that specific theater. Britain needed high-altitude interceptors to fight German bombers over England. But that verdict got generalized. The P-40 is unsuitable became the P-40 is inferior, period. And because the European theater dominated wartime media coverage and post-war historiography, the P-40's critical contributions in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific were written into footnotes, while the Spitfire versus Messerschmitt story became the canonical narrative of air warfare. The proof sits in the historical record, largely ignored. The XP-40Q prototype, fitted with a two-stage supercharged Allison V 1710-121, a bubble canopy, and clipped wings, reached 422 miles per hour at 20,000 feet with a service ceiling of 39,000 feet. That's performance competitive with the P-51D Mustang. The engine decision crippled the P-40's reputation, not the airplane itself. But the engine decision didn't happen in a vacuum. And that brings us to the corruption at Wright Field, Ohio, where every American fighter went through procurement. Let that evidence sink in for a moment, because what comes next is worse. Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, was the nerve center of all Army Air Force's aircraft acquisition during World War II. Every fighter that entered American service went through Wright Field. Every procurement decision was made there. Every test was conducted there. And Wright Field was rotten. Start with Major General Bennett E. Myers. He was second in command at the Air Materiel Command, one of the most powerful positions in military aviation procurement. His job was to ensure the Army got the best aircraft at the best price. What he actually did was run a criminal enterprise. Myers secretly owned a small aircraft parts company called Aviation Electric. He steered contracts toward manufacturers who purchased from his side business. This was documented. This was proven. This went on for years while American pilots flew into combat. Now here's where it connects to the P-40 and its supposed replacement. North American Aviation, the company that built the P-51 Mustang, did not buy Myers parts. The P-51 demonstrated spectacular performance as early as 1941. British test pilots were raving about it, but the Mustang was not fast-tracked for production until October 1943. That was over 2 years of delay. In March 1948, Bennett Myers was convicted on 3 counts of perjury. He was sentenced to prison. President Truman personally dismissed him from service and stripped every military decoration he had ever received. A corrupt official with personal financial interests was making procurement decisions that affected which fighters American pilots flew in combat. But Myers was not alone. Major General Oliver Eccles was described as the godfather of Army combat aircraft procurement. When North American Aviation delivered XP-51 test articles to Wright Field, Eccles was reportedly furious. North American Aviation President James H. Dutch Kindleberger had refused to simply build P-40s under license from Curtiss, insisting he could design something better. This apparent insubordination earned Eccles lasting resentment. Eccles' preferred replacement fighter was not the Mustang. It was the Fisher P-75 Eagle, a troubled design that one aviation historian described as doomed from the beginning, a sinkhole for cash. Bureaucrats at Wright Field actively slowed the limited supply of engines going to North American Aviation. Finished P-51 airframes piled up outside North American Aviation's factories, waiting for engines that should have been there months earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Hitchcock, the EFO, assistant air attaché in London, wrote the famous indictment that captures this entire dysfunction. He wrote that the Mustang was sired by the English out of an American mother, and that the Mustang has no parent at Wright Field to appreciate and push its good points. Multiple sources report that Dutch Kindleberger refused to pay kickbacks demanded by unnamed officials in exchange for a P-51 production contract. This allegation was reportedly corroborated during the Truman Committee investigation. Whether it connects directly to Myers, Eccles, or others remains circumstantial, but the convergence of documented corruption, documented obstruction, and credible kickback allegations creates a damning picture. The corruption extended to Curtiss-Wright itself. The Wright Aeronautical Corporation, a Curtiss-Wright subsidiary at its Lockland, Ohio engine plant, was caught in massive fraud by the Truman Committee in 1943. The investigation found that Wright was producing and causing the government to accept defective engines through falsification of tests, destruction of records, forging of inspection reports, and corruption of Army inspectors. 3 military officers were convicted. The War Department sued Wright Aeronautical and named 10 company executives as having conspired to defraud the government. The defective R-2600 engines killed student pilots in training. Arthur Miller's Pulitzer Prize-winning play, All My Sons, is directly based on this scandal, a father selling defective aircraft parts to the military during wartime. It wasn't fiction, it happened. Stop and consider what you've just heard. Documented bribery, falsified test records, defective engines that killed American pilots, congressional investigations, criminal convictions. This wasn't rumor or speculation. This was the verified, documented reality of American fighter procurement during World War II. And somehow the P-40 got blamed for being inferior. The P-40's fate cannot be separated from the spectacular self-destruction of its manufacturer. Curtiss-Wright held more defense contracts than any organization other than the vastly larger General Motors during World War II. The company ranked second among all American corporations in wartime production contract value. It had lobbyists, legislators, and friends in high places. This institutional weight made it extraordinarily difficult to shift procurement away from Curtiss products even as better alternatives existed. Curtiss-Wright's leadership came from the world of corporate finance and investment banking and had almost no direct connection with or understanding of the aviation industry. The company focused relentlessly on maximizing profit from existing designs rather than investing in research and development. The breaking point came in December 1941, the same month America entered the war. Don Berlin, the brilliant chief engineer who designed both the P-36 Hawk and the P-40 Warhawk, quit Curtiss-Wright. He left, frustrated with what he described as a lack of official backing for new development of the P-40. Berlin had plans for an advanced successor. The company's financial executives were not interested. They wanted to keep milking the existing design for profit. His departure was catastrophic. Every subsequent Curtiss fighter design failed. The XP-46 never reached production. The P-60 went through 12 different configurations without ever being ordered in quantity. The XP-62 was canceled. As one military history publication concluded, Curtiss had no aeronautical geniuses like Lockheed's Kelly Johnson, North American's Ed Schmuid, or Republic's Alexander Kartveli to push it to the forefront. Don Berlin was that genius, and Curtiss-Wright drove him away. The irony is piercing. Curtiss-Wright's political connections kept the P-40 in production longer than it should have been, enriching the company while preventing a faster transition to better aircraft. But the company's own fraud, mismanagement, and R&D neglect ensured it produced no worthy successor. The P-40 bore the reputational damage for both sins. North American aviation's origin story became aviation legend. Dutch Kindleberger told the Army he could build something better than the P-40. He delivered the Mustang. North American went on to build the F-86 Sabre, the X-15, and the Apollo Command Module. Curtiss-Wright exited the aircraft business entirely. It sold its aviation assets to North American. Winners write history. The P-51 became genius. Losers' obscurity condemned the P-40 to mediocrity. The reassessment of the P-40 Warhawk has gained significant momentum since the 1990s. Carl Molesworth, widely regarded as the foremost P-40 historian, has published over 15 books documenting the aircraft's combat effectiveness across multiple theaters. His Osprey series, including P-40 Warhawk vs. Bf-109, P-40 Warhawk Aces of the Pacific, and Sharks over China, methodically demonstrates the P-40's air superiority capabilities rather than dismissing it as merely a ground attack platform. Wikipedia's article now explicitly states the revisionist consensus. Although it gained a post-war reputation as a mediocre design suitable only for close air support, more recent research, including scrutiny of the records of individual Allied squadrons, indicates that this was not the case. The P-40 performed surprisingly well as an air superiority fighter. History and headlines called the Warhawk perhaps the most underrated fighter of the war. Real Clear History titled a 2021 piece, Most Underrated U.S. Fighter, P-40 Warhawk. But the most compelling testimony comes from the pilots themselves. David Tex Hill, of Flying Tiger's Triple Ace, who later became the youngest brigadier general in Air National Guard history, said in 2005, "In the hands of a skilled pilot, the P-40 could exceed its limitations and could outmaneuver and outfight anything in the sky. It was sturdy and handled well. I did not believe it was an inferior fighter." Robert D. Haven, who scored 10 of his 14 kills in P-40SS before transitioning to P-38s, insisted that if you flew wisely, the P-40 was a very capable aircraft. Clive Caldwell declared that P-40IS would take a tremendous amount of punishment, violent aerobatics as well as enemy action, with almost no vices. Australian ace Nicky Barr called the Kitty Hawk a friend, quite capable of getting you out of trouble more often than not. It was a real warhorse. Perhaps the most revelatory testimony comes from the Soviet Union. Major General Nikolai Galadnikov provided a devastating rebuttal to Western assessments. He explained that what the Allies thought, that it was not wise or almost impossible to fight with P-40S, we knew was not true. During the war, the P-40 was thought of as quite a good fighter in Soviet service. Soviet pilots extracted brutal performance from their Lend-Lease Warhawks by running engines at destructive power settings, removing wing guns to save weight, and routinely operating at war emergency power levels Western manuals forbade. The main difference in the assessment of P-40 combat capabilities comes from the fact that we and the Allies had completely different exploitation of the aircraft, Galadnikov explained. They used it as written in manuals, from letter to letter. We had a main rule: to take from the machine everything possible. The Soviets received over 2,400 P-40s through the Lend-Lease program. They asked for more. The P-40's case mirrors other World War II aircraft unfairly judged by narrow metrics. The Bell P-39 Era Cobra, dismissed in Western hands, produced the highest kill scores of any aviators flying American planes in Soviet service. Alexander Pokrishkin scored 47 of his 59 victories in a P-39. The Brewster Buffalo, labeled the worst fighter of World War II, achieved a 26-to-1 kill ratio with Finnish pilots. The Hawker Hurricane shot down more aircraft during the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire, yet it was written out of the narrative. Context matters more than raw specifications. Pilot skill, tactical employment, theater conditions, these determined whether a fighter succeeded or failed. The P-40 succeeded everywhere it flew, and it was called inferior. Anyway, the P-40 Warhawk was not the best fighter of World War II. Nobody credibly argues it was. But the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates it was far better than history remembers. And its poor reputation resulted from factors that had nothing to do with the airplane itself. A single technical limitation, the supercharger decision, was generalized into total inferiority. A British rejection based on one specific theater's requirements was applied universally. Documented corruption at Wright Field, Bennett Myers's secret company, Oliver Echol's bureaucratic obstruction, distorted procurement decisions for all American fighters, Curtiss Wright's own criminal fraud and managerial incompetence destroyed the company and retroactively poisoned its products' reputations. And post-war historiography, written from the perspective of the European bombing campaign, cemented a fighter hierarchy that treated the P-40 as a footnote. The human cost is incalculable but real. Every month that P-51 production was delayed by Wright Field obstruction and kickback demands, American pilots flew less capable aircraft into combat. Every defective engine that rolled off Curtiss Wright's Lachlan line endangered lives. Yet the plane that held the line during the war's most desperate hours, producing over 200 aces from 7 nations, costing just $53,000 compared to $126,000 for a P-38, entered history as inferior. The P-40 Warhawk did not fail. The system around it failed, and the airplane took the blame. Here's what I want you to do. If this story moved you, if learning the truth about the P-40 changed how you see World War II aviation history, share this video with someone. Who needs to hear it? These stories don't get told in classrooms. They don't get made into Hollywood movies. They only survive if people like you pass them on. Subscribe if you want more military history that goes beyond the textbook. I'm going to keep digging into the stories they tried to bury. And the next time you see that shark-mouthed Warhawk in a museum or at an air show, remember what it really was. Not the fighter that failed, the fighter they failed.